Welcome to the Creative Community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is writer and reviewer, Brian Tanguay. Brian, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You and I are collaborators on the California Review of Books. We have been book reviewers for The Independent in the past, and so I know you're writing well, but I've always just been kind of marveling at the stuff that you come up with in a really short amount of time, and I want to introduce you to as many folks as possible. Well, we're going to talk about California Review of Books, Working Class Scribbler, which is your Substack entry, and I'm curious though, how you got started, because you didn't get your BA when you turned 21, like some people. You were out and about.
Right. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I'm born and raised in Santa Barbara. I went to Hope School, La Colina, and San Marcos.
All right. That is very local, yeah.
I went into the Air Force right out of high school.
Okay.
Spent 6 years in Japan.
Okay.
And during that time, in the late 70s, of course, there was no internet. There was no FaceTime. Communication was difficult, so we had to communicate with our families by letter. So getting a letter was a big deal.
Right, right.
And so that is how I actually started writing, because I was a young man and I was in this foreign place, and I had a lot to write about, a lot of things to describe, and so that's
where you made your bones as a writer, yeah.
Essentially, I started to write, and of course, prior to that, I'd always been a reader. I've always been a voracious reader, so even as early as I remember in second grade, we had some sort of contest, who can read the most books, and
I'm sure you were the
I think I
winner.
lapped the field or something,
Yeah.
but it's just, that just always came very easily to me. So the reading coupled with being in a place that was very inspiring, I just started, that's kind of how I got started in writing.
Right.
And I've always continued, I've always kept a journal. And that's basically how I taught myself how to write.
Yeah, when I first remember kind of becoming aware of you as a fellow book reviewer at the Independent, and I think I started Googling in the UCSB English department, because I assumed that you were a professor. What made you decide to go to the Air Force rather than go to college when you are such a literate person?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I honestly went in the Air Force because I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. And I thought, if I go to school now, I might waste my time. And I, like a lot of kids at that time period, at that age, I had a certain sense of wanderlust and kind of an itch for adventure. And so I thought, well, this will be something that I can go and do. And I had, you never know where they're going to send you. They could send you anywhere. Right. I was very fortunate to go to Japan, and I had a tremendous experience there at a time when that country was, throwing off the impediments of the Second World War, which they had just been devastated, and becoming a rising economic power at the time. Enough where the United States began to really worry about Japan as a competitor, even though they were one of our staunchest allies in Asia.
So you finished your 6 years in the Air Force. What happened after that?
Then I came back to the States. I lived in Honolulu for a while because my mom lives there. I moved to Seattle, lived there for a short time. Then I came back home, started going to City College, worked at Delco Electronics out in Goleta while it was still there. Enrolled at Antioch University, got my bachelor's at 35 years of age, which was, for me, it was a big accomplishment. I was the first person in my family to get a college degree, so I was proud of that, even though it took a really long time. And then I went to work for the Santa Barbara Unified School District and was there for 22 years.
Involved in union activities, I understand.
I was. I was the local president of the Classified Employees Union. I did a lot of lobbying in Sacramento as part of the state legislative committee, and I think that's where I sort of got interested in politics. That, and I did a really deep, long dive into Hunter S. Thompson. I think I read everything he wrote, including his 3 volumes of letters, which is amongst his best work, were his letters. And so I became very interested in politics.
So he is a very activist writer, but also someone who writes a lot about his own personal
Right.
foibles, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
kind of all braided together.
Yeah, it was the Gonzo style, so it was very much about him and what was the events that he was covering. But
Right.
of course, he was often quite addled with
Right.
with drugs and booze. But he still managed to be very. He was a very wickedly keen observer of the American scene.
So for a long time, you had a blog yourself, right? Where you were.
I did. My wife encouraged me to start this blog, so I started it in 2004.
That's a long time ago for a blog. Yeah,
And
that's
so
early blog.
It was one of the early. It was on Blogspot.
Sure,
And,
yeah.
I had really no idea what I was doing, but I was very upset about the Iraq War, the war on terror. I didn't like George W. Bush too much, and so there was a lot to write about in that time. So I started it, kept it up through the Obama years, and all the way through Trump. And then late last year, I said, okay, 1,000 posts or 20 years, whichever comes first, and I'm done. And so I hit that 1,000 posts, and I said, okay, I'm done with this.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, it's an interesting. It covers this entire period.
If people want to take a dive into that, what would they search for?
Shouts from the Balcony was what it was,
Shouts from the
and it also has a lot of it has to do with the COVID pandemic. Since I wrote something I called the Isolation Diaries within. I just started writing about what it was like day to day during the early days of the pandemic when there was so much confusion.
Well, that evolved into Working Class Scribbler.
Right.
And that's interesting. That's why I was so curious about your background. It's like that, you said you're the first person in your family to go to college. So you're writing from that perspective, even though you're writing from, as many working class writers are, from, point of great intellect and insight and acuity. So people who want to take a look at that and subscribe, as I do, Brian, would go to briantanguy.substack.com.
That's right. Yeah.
So Working Class Scribbler. Could we hear a little bit from the Scribbler?
Sure. This one is called The Nightmare on Milpas Street. I wrote this in November of 2023, and it's called The Nightmare on Milpas Street, Trump's Little Red Book. And I'll just read a short bit of it. Never doom scroll before bed. Listen instead to soothing hang drums and nature sounds, or listen to Gregorian chants at a calming 432 hertz. But for the love of all that is sane and holy, don't dive deep into politics before sleep. Nightmares will follow, like the one I'm about to share with you. It's the day after the 2024 election. Joe Biden has called Donald Trump and conceded. Half the nation is in shock, and the streets of New York City, Los Angeles, Boston, and Chicago are as deserted as they were at the height of the COVID pandemic. But in Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Texas, and South Carolina, the streets are jammed with armed Trump supporters. Outside of Mar-a-Lago, a crowd estimated at 50,000. Disclaimer, this estimate was provided by the Trump campaign. A spokesperson for the West Palm Beach Police Department estimated the crowd at 500, has gathered a river of red hats and blue Trump 2024 flags. While the mood is festive, like the opening day at the Neshoba County Fair, there's a distinctly retributive edge. Scattered gunshots can be heard. A group of men wearing black hoods and calling themselves hangmen for Trump are busy erecting a gallows. The West Palm Beach police stand by doing nothing. A chant begins in the crowd, and before long it has been taken up by hundreds. Hang Joe Biden, hang Jack Smith, hang Tanya Chutkin. Like a partisan crowd at a World Cup match, the chants roll and rumble across Mar-a-Lago, gathering volume.
Pretty petrifying.
It gets worse, actually. But yeah, that was just a bit of satire I wrote because I was, it's my way of dealing with
Well, it's a bit of satire, but as a regular reader of your blog, I know that those themes come back all the time. Most recently you were talking about the idea that the false equivalency between Trump and Biden is just ridiculous, and always you're kind of hinting at November 2024, January 2025, where something like that could actually happen. You reference is it the Samuel L. Jackson character in Jurassic Park, who
right.
says, "Hold on to your butts,"
Right.
you know, after he reboots the system.
Right.
To what extent are you genuinely afraid of that happening?
I'm concerned. I think that there's now something in this country that's been loosed, which is, it's anti-democratic, it's authoritarian, it's very scary. And I think when you look at countries where they've had an attempted overthrow, it's not usually one and done. It's usually they try it and then they try it again. Right. And that's why I think it's a very, very real possibility that we have enough people in the country and in the entire Republican Party nationally, which is of the opinion that elections are kind of, they don't matter. The outcomes don't matter. They don't have to respect them.
So in that regard, if Trump were to lose, then they would just act as though he'd won. If he were to win, they would just take over the country, you're saying, and just ignore the protocols of our democracy.
I think the prospect of him winning, I think you would see him immediately beginning to try to aggregate power to himself, to the office of the presidency. Right. Yeah. And then we have to ask, what would prevent him from doing that?
Right. And we see very little, apparently.
The guardrails are pretty damaged, I think. Yeah. And it's frightening. And so, you know, I'm a 64-year-old man, but I have children who are in their 20s, and I'm very concerned about it because I want them to live in a democracy.
Right.
And it is a possibility that we could lose it.
Right. Well, and then we have children having children who are just little kids.
Correct.
You know, and that's
the stakes are very high, I think.
Yeah.
Higher than I think people are willing to acknowledge at this point.
So what can we as writers do? I mean, I think it's hard to find someone more articulate and eloquent and persuasive in making the case that you were just describing. But aren't we just kind of preaching to the choir mostly?
I feel that. I feel myself that I am. I don't think there are a lot of people who support, let's say, Donald Trump, or most Republicans would agree with what I'm saying. But what I want to remind people of is just that democracy is imperfect. We know we have a lot of problems with democracy in the country. We have structural problems that have been baked in since the beginning, since the founding. But let's not throw the whole system out. Because you think autocracy might be better. You need to rethink that. Think about it carefully. Is that really what we want in this country? Yeah. Or a flawed democracy that is still perfectible? Yeah. That's one of my things. Is I think there are enough people who are of goodwill and common sense, but they're the silent majority, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, then that's one of the things about your columns is that I feel that outrage, and then I always feel it kind of drawing back towards what you just said. Let's be reasonable. What are the reasonable ways to deal with this unreasonable force that's out there? Could you read one more from Working Class Scribbler? Is there another?
Sure. So this one was called The Ultimate Protection Racket, and it comes from my sort of instinct that the best way to understand Donald Trump is to view him through the lens of a mob boss, through the New York Mafia. Right. Anyways, more than a year ago, I wrote that Trump's behavior and rhetoric would become more and more extreme and less tethered to reality as indictments were filed against him and court trials began and his legal expenses mounted. Sure enough, Trump looks unwell and his speeches and interviews are more incoherent than ever. He showers praise on Viktor Orban of Hungary as if Hungary is a major player on the world stage and not a landlocked country about the size of Indiana. But his latest ploy is even more breathtaking. He's trying to convince anyone who will take him seriously that an American president, Trump means himself, no one else, must have total and absolute immunity from prosecution for criminal acts committed while in office. Trump claims that unless the president has absolute immunity, the opposition party will automatically attempt to prosecute him when he leaves office. Naturally, this claim has no basis in fact or American history. The only president who has faced criminal prosecution after leaving office was Richard Nixon, which is why he needed a pardon from Gerald R. Ford. Trump's asking for the powers of an unaccountable dictator like that enjoyed by Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping in China.
Well,
Yeah.
when it kind of shifts gears away, because that's very heavy stuff. I mean, again,
Very heavy, yeah.
yeah,
And
as it should be. I mean, you know, I honestly, Brian, I feel like you could be writing for the New York Times or the Washington Post, a weekly column, and if they're out there watching, I think they need to get in touch with you right away. But Working Class Scribbler, for folks who've been thinking, where can I hear more of this, is on Substack. Let's move towards our shared endeavor, the California Review of Books. So you and I had been kind of the main book reviewers for the Independent for some years, and then during the pandemic, they decided that they wanted to focus just on local local folks. You know, ad revenue was drying up because a lot of the ad revenue comes from performances in town, and there was nothing. Yeah. Anyway, that's changed. Thanks to our friend Leslie Dynaberg, our reviews are coming back in there, but they're coming back through the California Review of Books. So, what's your memory of how we decided to come up with this particular enterprise?
well, I still think it's one of the most interesting collaborations in the way it happened, because it all happened so casually, it seemed. I remember we met and we said, you know, we could start something, and then you had Chris Yost,
our friend, yeah, who's our technical editor.
Our technical editor and our web person, and somehow, suddenly we had a website, and we started putting up content. And we have other contributors like Walter Cummins, who's wonderful, and George Atchison. And it's grown into something that, and you and I don't collaborate directly very often. We
emails.
We email now. Here's what I'm writing about, or I don't even ask, and I just
vice versa,
wait and I see what you put. I said, oh wow, that's really interesting. But it seems to run quite seamlessly, which is kind of amazing. And I think there's a lot of content up there that is really, really good. And not only that, but somehow, even though we don't plan it, we are tracking very closely with the New York Review of Books, the London Review. I mean, we're right up there with what I call the big dogs of literary criticism. And it kind of just happens organically, which is really amazing to me.
Yeah, it's been, you know, we're kind of tooting our own horns here, but just to do that for a moment, if people are interested, California Review of Books is at calirb.com. Calirb.com is the place to go, or just to Google it. But yeah, I feel like we've done a lot of things, and our articles, our reviews tend to be shorter. Mine especially, yours tend to be a little bit longer. But they're meant to be read in a sitting, to run through there. And it's interesting, I think, partly that we are reviewing sometimes books that wouldn't get a wider read. So I review a lot of poetry, which is reviewed almost nowhere. So I'm always inundated with new books of poetry, because I feel like I give it a fair read, and then there's a relatively decent audience for it. But you're reviewing a lot of the really major political pieces that are coming out. When you are doing a review, I know you're very meticulous in taking notes. Could you kind of walk us through a typical review for you?
Yeah, well, while I'm a voracious reader, I'm a slow reader. I feel like I read fairly slowly, and I make a lot of notes. So I'll have far more in the way of notation than I can actually use. But I do go through and I transcribe all my notes from the book onto a separate document. And I do that to kind of get a sense of the author's style, their voice, what their main points are. But also it gives me an aperture. Eventually, I'll find my lead in by going through all that material. And I'm trying to capture the essence of it, usually. Just what is the main thrust of this? Because like you said, in contrast to some of like the New York Review books, which has brilliant essays, but they're very long.
They're really long, yeah.
And ours are, what, 1,000 words, 1,200 words at max.
Yeah.
Most of them are 600, which for a person just coming in one sitting, that's a nice digestible bite, in my opinion.
It is.
But to write a review of a long book with a lot of ideas,
In the few words, yeah.
in 600 to 700 words, that to me is where you start getting into the art of the book review, because you have to choose judiciously and very carefully about what you're going to include. Right. And so that's what I try to do. I try to think in my mind, how can I polish this where I'm getting the most faceted part of it in front of the reader.
Yeah. So you're like somebody working on a diamond.
I think of it in a bit like chipping away at a sculpture sometimes. I mean, I have this mass of material, but it's winnowing it down to try to get to those key points, I think.
Well, I think one of the things about like James Woods is a famous book reviewer for the New York Times. He tends to write a long review, but his sentences are so well crafted, and I think that's something that you and I are, as you just said, are both trying to do. There's also a kind of an interesting balance that you take between writing that what you think of as a beautiful sentence and making sure that it accurately reflects what's in the book. You know, sometimes you can get a little carried away with or I can, with your rhetoric, and you're like, well, I think I'm just kind of straying a little bit too far from where I should be going.
Yeah, and so the process for me is to write many drafts and do a lot of cutting and a lot of editing, a lot of self-editing. Sometimes ruthlessly, because I realize, well, that's a nice bit, but it just doesn't connect to the whole. And then working it over to try to make it as readable as possible. And that's very important to me, to make sure that it reads. I like muscular prose, I think. I think that comes from, you know, when I was very young, I read a lot of Hemingway. I read a lot of Jack London. I read a lot of Philip Roth, who writes sentences that are so beautiful and so well constructed. And I kind of got that rhythm in my head. And I like that kind of writing.
We got about 5 minutes left. I'd love to hear you. I know you have a review on your phone. I'd love to hear at least part of one.
Yeah, this is this book, which I really enjoyed. This was Our Ancient Faith. It's Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. The author is a Lincoln scholar named Alan C. Guelzo. And it's a short book, but it's really a remarkably good book about democracy. What did Lincoln believe about democracy? Foundationally, that it was a regime of reason and law rather than unreason and passion. Lincoln recognized that people often abandoned reason for passion, but the antidote to excess passion wasn't more or equal passion, it was the rule of law. The law was public reason uttered by the public voice. Over and over again in speeches, letters, notes, and state papers, he emphasized that America and its institutions belonged to the people who inhabited the country. Lincoln never doubted that Americans would suffer much for the safekeeping of their democracy.
Yeah, it sounds like it could have come from working class scribbler. You know, that's one of the things I admire about your writing is the consistency of thought. I feel like, you know, you're seeking out books that if they challenge your point of view, you're willing to discuss that, but you're also kind of writing from a perspective that's, I think, pretty steady.
Yeah, I think I have a fairly, it is fairly steady perspective. But I do like challenging books, and I don't mind being stretched or being made to stop and go, okay, what is it that I believe? How does that change what I think? Those are good moments. For a book reviewer, they're great moments.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I don't know if you have people ask you, like, what would you like me to read? Or what's a good, you got any good book recommendations? I always say, well, just go on our website, California Review of Books, and we've got plenty of things. And I think we have a kind of consistent aesthetic. We're both left-leaning. I tend to do more in the arts and fiction and poetry and stuff like that. But we will cross over and do things that the other person is sometimes covering. But I do think that we do have a wide range of books. A lot of the books that, like you said, are being talked about across the country at a certain time are reviewed in our web pages. But we also have little gems. For instance, I just reviewed a book called The Lichen Museum about how lichen can be a great symbol for a way that we can live in the world without disturbing it unnecessarily. I just came across that. I liked it. Boom, in it goes. And that's another thing that we have. We, so far, have not been really interested in making a lot of money off of our enterprise, the California Review of Books, which gives us complete and total freedom to do whatever the hell we want to, right? I mean, that's one of the things that I treasure about our relationship, is that neither of us has been pushing too hard to sort of make a big buck off of this.
It's part of our what I call sort of the strangeness of our collaboration. I think we're good writers and lousy capitalists. I mean, really lousy capitalists. But we also, I think, we balance each other, because, like you said, you get into the poetry, some of the literary fiction. I do a lot of nonfiction with some literary fiction. Right. It seems to balance out nicely, and then we have George and Walter and our other contributors to kind of round us out. What I really enjoy is when I go into the book den or Chaucer's and I look at the books, the current ones, and I say, oh, we did that one, and we did that one, and we did that one. Right? We're right on the pulse. We are on the pulse. Somehow, and we don't even talk about it, but somehow we're on the pulse. I find that really remarkable.
Yeah. We have literally 60 seconds left, in 15 or 20 seconds at the most. One piece of advice that you would give to a young person out there who would like to be a writer like what you're doing?
Read.
Okay.
Widely. Everything you can get your hands on.
Okay.
Just read.
Read.
Yeah, and let what you read lead you to the next great writer. That's how let it scaffold.
Okay.
Because I think that's what happened with me.
Perfect way to end. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it,
Thank
Brian.
you for having me.
The Creative Community is a co-production of TVSB in Santa Barbara and CAPS Media in Ventura. I'm your host, David Starkey, and we'll see you next time.